Welcome to Pods by PEI. I'm your host for today, Soumitra Neopani, and we are diving into arguably one of the most anticipated events of the year in Nepal, the annual budget speech.
बजेटलाई आर्थिक तथा सामाजिक क्षेत्रमा देखिएका चुनौती सम्बोधन गर्दै आम नागरिकमा आत्मविश्वास र आशा जगाउने दस्तावेजको रूपमा प्रस्तुत गरेको छु.
Now, the annual budget speech for the government of Nepal is quite special. In fact, it's the only event date explicitly mentioned in the constitution. See Article 119.3 if you don't believe me. The practice of preparing an annual budget dates back to the year 1951, right after Nepal's political transition that led to the end of the Rana regime in the country. Subarna Sumsher, the finance minister then, had publicly announced an outlay of Nepali rupees 50.25 million. However, the political context of the country then was such that the budget was not presented in the Nepali parliament, but announced via Radio Nepal. It was only much later in 1959 that a budget was first presented to the Nepali parliament. Since then, the budgetary practice has evolved, but still continues to hold significance and with some fanfare. What is the day like? Picture this. The finance minister walks to the podium with a document briefcase wrapped in a red ribbon.
माननीय सदस्यहरू,
Anticipation and excitement fill the air as people eagerly await to hear what's included or excluded in the budget. But why all the hype, you may ask? Well, the budget is the government's major fiscal intervention. It outlines where the government plans to spend, that's the scope of its expenditures, and how it's going to raise funds to meet those spending requirements. That's the scope of its income or revenue. A key aspect of this policy document that appeals to the general public is taxes. This policy literally influences everything. It dictates how much of your earnings you pay back to the government, the cost of your daily essentials, your favorite chocolate, or the price of your next beer. If you're thinking about making a big purchase, changes in tax brackets could mean you either love or hate the budget. For those of you who were thinking of buying a new electric vehicle this time, you pretty sure know what I mean. Now, people often say that this year's budget is particularly important, but let's be real, that's what they say every year. The truth is, every budget is unique and crucial in its own way, as it is a response to the specific issues and challenges of the economy at that given time. Governments use the budget to manage the economy, using expansionary policies to boost growth through higher spending or contractionary policies to curb demand through reduced spending. This year's budget, however, is special for several reasons. First, the Nepali economy is rebounding from a significant downturn, observing a mere growth of little over 1% last year. Second, this year is pivotal as Nepal prepares for its 2026 graduation from the Least Development Country status, or LDCs. Third is the first year of Nepal's newly formulated 16th periodic plan from the year 2025 to 2030, the timeline of which also aligns with the end of the Sustainable Development Goals. Beyond these points, this year's budget also addresses critical political and economic issues currently impairing the Nepali economy. For example, resolving the cooperative crisis, strengthening the investment climate, and ensuring financial accountability. So in today's episode, we'll cover what's in the budget as well as the issues and sentiments of the budget. We'll break down the key allocations, policies, and their potential impacts. But first, let's begin by analyzing the economic context of the country today and understanding why this budget stands to be somewhat more special than that of the previous years. So what is the economic context of the country today? Lately, I've heard people say different things. Limping, leveraged, stuttering, dismal, and the list continues. Clearly, the perception is very poor. But is this just a perception or a fact?
We're not in a crisis. We've not been in a crisis, except if you take into account during COVID, of course, our economy contracted like most economies around the world. But we have been in this slow economic growth period for a long time. We always aim for a higher growth rate, but we never seem to quite achieve it.
That was Samir Khatiwada, a PhD in economics and currently affiliated with the Asian Development Bank as a senior economist. He was previously with the International Labour Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. Now that I found a doctor qualified to examine the Nepali economy, I asked Samir for a health check and a diagnosis of the Nepali economy.
My first diagnostics of Nepal's economy tells me that our economic structure is not geared towards economic growth and job creation in any substantive kind of way. When I compare Nepal to India or Bangladesh or any other country that's doing very well economically, Nepal does lack a few ingredients that countries that have done relatively well have a few things that go well for them, right? One is the industrial sector, the manufacturing sector tends to do very well. At least it tends to do better than what it's been doing in Nepal, right? Second, a private sector-led development. This is something that's very critical, and we see this across Asia, even in China, which is a communist one-party state. Private sector development is absolutely critical, and that's something that we have lacked. Third ingredient is infrastructure, good infrastructure. Without good infrastructure, we cannot compete. We're not economically competitive. And this, we have seen, has been one of the most chronic hindrance to our economic growth. What I mean by infrastructure, both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Hard infrastructure meaning roads, airports, that kind of infrastructure. But the soft infrastructure is related to skill capacity. By and large, our skill set is limited, meaning our workforce is not as competitive. Yes, more and more people are educated. Perhaps they're getting degrees, diplomas, but in terms of being skilled, being equipped with employable skills, that is a challenge. And when I look at the World Bank's enterprise surveys, you always see this. Of course, you see that in every country where the employers complain they can't find the right people. But in case of Nepal, I think it might run a bit deeper also. Our foundation is rather weak. So when the foundation is weak, no matter what you do, in terms of TVET or higher education, it's too late to catch up at that point, right? And the fourth ingredient, institutions. Institutions are very important. And here, again, I don't know what it is, to be honest with you. I don't know why we can't build strong institutions, but somehow we have been unable to build strong institutions. We have politicized most aspects of our economy in that sense, and which is unfortunate, right? And when we talk about institutions, what's also important is, policy, the role policy plays, policy certainty. You can have political instability, fine, but can we at least have policy certainty? That the rules don't change when the prime minister changes or the finance minister changes, right? And of course, the fifth challenge of governance cuts across everything that we do. Good governance is critical. And here I think it's a work in progress. We have made some progress towards it, but long way to go.
Samir mentions an interesting point on political and policy stability. This has been one of the most defining challenges of the country in the recent past. We will, however, come back to this a bit later in the episode. I continued my conversation with Samir on the idea of Nepal's slow economic growth. There are growth percentages being floated around, but how is the economy growing, and what do the numbers actually mean? The idea of Nepal's slow economic growth is something that is increasingly gaining momentum in the public discourse. I asked Samir to unpack this a bit and compare Nepal's growth with other countries in the region. This is what he had to say.
In the last 5 fiscal years, if you look at our average growth, it's about 3.3%. Right? And this past year, I think depending on who you look at, IMF or ADB, World Bank, it's 3.7, 3.1 for this current fiscal year. For the next one, 4.8, 4.9 is expected. Our budget expects 6%, right? 6% would be fantastic. I think our potential growth rate is about 5%. But if you want to raise the potential, of course, we have to work on those other things I mentioned at the very beginning, right? So the growth, the reason why this indicator is so critical is that if we want to be like Bangladesh per capita income, it's about 2,400, 500 right now, more or less double than ours, right? If we want to get to that point, for the next 10 years, we have to grow at 7% per year, which we have managed only once, 2 consecutive years after the Gorkha earthquake, the reconstruction, that's it. Otherwise, we have never achieved 7% growth rate. So imagine that, to get to a place where Bangladesh is, it takes us 10 years of strong growth. To get to where Sri Lanka is, It takes us about 20 years of strong growth. So when you hear people say, by exporting electricity or by getting some things correct infrastructure-wise, that we're going to achieve strong growth. We'll achieve better growth, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we are so far behind that 1 year of 7%, 2 years of 7% is not going to get where we want to be. So this is very important. And the reason why I talk about economic growth is that, I spent close to a decade working on labor market issues at the International Labor Organization, did a lot of labor diagnostics, different countries. I've looked at labor market across these types of countries, high income, middle income, low income countries, right? You look at all these countries, there's a common factor that drives job creation. It's strong economic growth. There's nothing else. It's not the Prime Minister Employment Program that gives you employment. None of that stuff. Some political gimmick to attract workers or skill development initiative that's one-off. It's not thought through. So we really need to think about, how do we achieve strong economic growth? And there are a few things we can achieve with strong economic growth. Let's look at industries. Let's look at high-value services. Let's look at manufacturing's role. So we have to focus on a few of these things. And when I look at countries that have done well, they have done well in these areas.
With that context check, let us get started with the top-line highlights of the budget. First, let us begin by discussing its structure. It's actually very simple and similar to how households budget their income and spending. The only major difference being the number of zeros that go in the numbers. The budget consists of two separate forecasts, one on expenditures and one on income or revenue. Expenditures are divided into recurring, capital, and debt servicing. And on the income side, there are revenue estimates from taxes, and where applicable, a strategy to meet the revenue gap through domestic and foreign resources, grants, loans, etc. So then what do we have for the upcoming fiscal year? Well, the total forecasted budget stands to be at Nepali rupees 1.86 trillion, slightly under $14 billion. Of this, 61% is allocated as reoccurring, 19% is allocated for capital expenditures, and 20% for debt servicing. Around 2/3 of the total budget is forecasted to be met through internal revenue incomes, i.e. taxes. And there is a 1/3 resource gap, meaning the government will need to mobilize external resources through grants and borrowing to actually meet its stated commitments in the budget. Here is Samir again unpacking the numbers in the budget and what they mean.
Broadly, they make sense, just the numbers, given how we have done in the past, right? Not one aspect that I like about this budget is the recurrent expenditure. They're sort of trying to make sure that this doesn't increase, and there have been some limits that have been announced in the budget. This is very good. So in that sense, there's nothing that stands out that, this is unusual, right? Debt servicing, okay, it's debt servicing. In terms of trend, it's been a huge increase. I will give you that, but as a share of GDP, or given the size of our economy, it's really not that much of a concern just yet. In terms of the capital expenditure or recurrent expenditure, that also more broadly makes sense to me. If you look at the recurrent expenditure, some of the items there, Social Security, grants, subsidies, compensation, something that nothing really stands out. Grants, it's a bit of I think there was some debate over that in the parliament also today. In terms of capital expenditure, there's a lot of focus on building public buildings as well. I guess we are trying to get our new parliament building ready as well, right? So that contributes to it as well, I think. So yeah, just looking at the numbers, on the revenue side, it's slightly more optimistic than I would have thought. Otherwise, it's okay. A growth projection also optimistic given our performance.
But just looking at the budget from the revenue side, it's almost been a systemic challenge for the Nepali economy that we don't meet our revenue targets. How much of that revenue base looks realistic and achievable given our past performance, and especially last year?
Well, it is ambitious. It is ambitious, our revenue targets, but it could be possible to achieve the targets. When you look at revenue, right, you need to have an economic base. You need to increase the size of the economic pie, so to speak, to collect higher revenues. And a lot of times I think we are focused on not really raising the size of the pie, right? So, for example, most of our revenue, close to 50%, comes from customs-related revenue. Even customs tax, import tax, also import duties, and then the VAT also adds to it, I think. When you add all of that up, you kind of get close to that 50% mark. And there, our tax administration has improved tremendously in the last several years, and I'm aware of some of the reforms that they have done in the customs side as well. So yes, so our revenue collection has improved in the last several years. As you know, a few years ago, it was about over 20%, 22% of share of GDP, right? Tax as a share of GDP, and I think it went down to 16. Now it's picking up again. For a country at our income level, that is pretty remarkable that we are able to collect that amount of taxes. When I look at the recent budget announcement, income tax has gone up also for some groups as well, right? And the other taxes that have gone up as well, I have to look through it closely, but there are some other taxes have gone up. I think one thing that our authorities should keep in mind is that, you cannot hope to grow by taxing your citizens wherever you can, right? Because it's sort of like taxes are a disincentive for work, for economic activity, for all of that, right? So this is we have to do this in a more of a careful way. I think we have become very reliant on of course, it's very important for us. But what has happened is that, the finance ministers, when they come to the office and when they leave, they talk about how well they did in terms of collecting revenue. They use that as their mark of success. And to me, that has always sounded really strange. A finance minister bragging that he managed to collect this much revenue from businesses, right? I would love to see a finance minister bragging about the jobs that they have created, businesses that have been established under their tenure, foreign investment that have come in during their time. I would love to see that as a bragging point, not how much revenue you have collected. So this is something that, it's more fundamental. So when you look at the composition of our taxes, right? So the share of custom and toll revenue, this is an important share, but if you look at the income tax has also gone up. It used to be so for example, even in 2050, Bikram Samvat, for example, it was like around less than 8% income tax as a share of total tax revenue, total revenue. And now it's about 25, 26%, right? Over the years, this has really gone up. So even the income tax has really, and usually income tax collection, of course, the tax administration is not as good at collecting income taxes, but they're better at customs and VAT and all of that. VAT, of course, is very important. Still to this day, it's very important. It's about 30% of VAT. So on income, I think what has happened is that somehow, of course, it takes a bit of homework to come up with the tax rates and all of that. But I think what I would actually suggest is to lower maybe even the tax rates, especially when it comes to income, and then maybe make it easier to file income taxes, or make it more not as regressive as I think it is sometimes, so this is something that one needs to look at more carefully. But I generally tend to agree that, there are too many taxes in this country. And I think it's basically reflective of the fact that our production base, our home production base is not that big, right? So we have to come up with ways to run the country, right? The revenue runs the country. So we have to actually tax our citizens. And I think in the budget, even the minister actually said we need to shift away from this, remittance, customs-based sort of economic model towards more domestic production, where we tax businesses that are operating here, creating jobs, creating products and services that people want to buy, right? So we want to move there. But somehow we haven't been able to do this. And also it points to our private sector is not very competitive. It's relatively small. There are very few firms that with more than 20 employees, 18%, I think last time I checked. So, it's very largely informal. They're not competitive. They don't make products that they can sell in the global markets and compete with our regional and global competitors, right? So there are many issues like that. I think we have to take it in that context. We have to understand the context when we talk about taxes.
Moving on to expenditures, beyond the money that needs to be spent to keep the government running and pay for its debts, there isn't much the government actually allocates to begin with. These are capital expenditures, and this year they've been budgeted at Nepali rupees 352 billion, or only around 19% of the total budget. This is the budget that the government spends to build new things, houses, building, bridges, etc. The good thing, however, is that the allocation this year on this heading is up 50 million from the last year. But this allocation is, in fact, highly nuanced. To begin with, it's only a modest allocation. And interestingly, this too the government habitually falls short of actually spending. And in the event of shortfalls in resources for the budget, this is the allocation that tends to take the first hit. So you get the picture. There is a commitment for expenditure, but it is not fully spent and usually stricken out of the budget very easily. Moreover, this is a category dominated by large infrastructure projects. What you essentially end up with in the budget is a capital expenditure pool consisting of vast number of inadequately resourced projects and initiatives across all imaginable sectors. While this is not ideal, it is unavoidable. Let us not forget, the budget is, after all, also a political policy document. Unfortunately, expenditures tend to be more fragmented when the politics is also fragmented, and this is exactly the case in Nepal. This year's allocations, like last year, remains a mixed bag. Some commendable and new initiatives, a bunch of necessary and unavoidable ones, a few half-baked ideas, and copied from elsewhere ideas, several usual repetitions, some questionable inclusions, and some that are outright controversial. There are other categories I've missed, those that are funny, and many that have been placed there just for optics. But we will not discuss these today. The proof is in the pudding. Maybe 6 months into the year, we'll know how much progress there is across all of these different allocations. Instead, I want to focus today on some rather interesting observations and mentions in the budget. To begin with, priority one in the budget this year is not where to spend, but economic reforms and promotion of private sector. The budget calls for the conceptualization and implementation of a new wave of economic reforms in the country. The broad scope of these reforms will relate to institutions, investment climate, public finance management, the financial sector, and public administration. I probe these inclusions further with Samir.
So second generation reform sounds very nice, and I'm all for it. But are we, will we manage to implement some of those reforms? Can we get acts through the parliament? And can we come up with the implementation guidelines in time to see some impact, right? So this is something that will be very important, I think. And, they are going for, sort of the improving industrial and business environment. And I think this is very encouraging. There were several items in the budget that was focused on this. And they also realize the role of industrialization, even the manufacturing sector, IT services, tourism, of course, always is there, energy, agribusiness, everything that sounds very good. So I kind of want to see the impact, because otherwise, it's actually very easy to come up with these things. To be honest with you, if anybody who has worked in different countries has looked at economic performances, you can come up with 10 different things, reforms you can put together, put it in a nice piece of paper, and make an announcement. But that's not how things actually get done, right? So I would like to see that translate into actual action. Our macro fundamentals have been just a bit of an off-kilter. It sort of hasn't been in the right place for the last 10, 15 years. If you wanted to make money in Nepal, there's two ways you could do it. One is you would invest in real estate. Second would be you import goods from outside, you sell it at a markup in Nepal. So in these two areas where people made money, and to some extent they are still making money in these two spaces. When the government put restrictions for import of cars, I remember to save on the foreign exchange reserves, and there was hue and cry about jobs are being lost in the auto sector. And I remember looking at the news and thinking, I didn't realize we were assembling cars in Nepal. But of course we weren't, right? Now Hyundai, for example, is trying. But otherwise, we're not adding any value. We're just marketing it here, selling it. So that is not the type of economy that we want. We want to be able to produce some here. Why aren't we able to tell firms that sell their goods here, if you want to sell your products in our country, you have to manufacture at least 30% of them here. Why can't we say that? We are finally starting to do those things. Like in the motorcycle, Royal Enfield is now being assembled in Nepal. That's good news. But why weren't we able to do that 15 years ago? It's not like we became import dependent just overnight and all of a sudden we're figuring these solutions out, right? So these solutions were always there. We have allowed our economy to go off track for a long time. And now we wonder why we can't create jobs, why young people are leaving. Because where do the jobs come from? Jobs come from, assembly plant, auto assembly plant that Hyundai is putting together. That's where the jobs come from. Engineers from Pulchuk Engineering Campus or somewhere else can get a job there. I think here, what has done a lot of damage to our economy is also chronic political instability. The latest World Bank Enterprise Survey, I just did some analysis based on that for our country diagnostic study that we're preparing. 41% of the firms still say political instability is the main factor, right? access to finance, electricity, these things come a distant second, third, fourth, at 12, 9% of firms saying that. So political instability has really contributed to this situation where, political instability has led to policy instability, policy uncertainty. And when that happens, it's very hard to do business in a country, right? So say, for example, you manufacture motorcycles. You make a deal with the government. Okay, I'm going to manufacture these many motorcycles. I need 1,000 workers in my factory here close to Butwal or wherever you're establishing it. And then you come up with some incentives. You get fiscal incentives from the province or from the central government. You set up shop. Next year, some finance minister comes along and says, no, I don't want to give you that fiscal incentive, or says, where's my cut of the deal, right? And this is the situation we are in, right? So how does a business function like that? So, and I think in a weird way, I think, to be honest with you, the folks who have been at the helm of policy making, who have been making our economic policy, perhaps sometimes haven't really understood what creates jobs, what drives growth. Because, even when I look at our discourse, I find that we tend to vilify, we turn businesses into demons. They're not our friends. We don't see them as our partners in development, which is really a sad situation, to be honest. Because, if anything, a government doesn't create jobs. It creates a small number of jobs. Even in Scandinavia, you look at Scandinavia, 25% of the economy is probably public sector, but the rest of it is private sector, right? Some of the largest private firms are from Scandinavia. IKEA, great example, no? So the thing is, what has happened is that over the years, our political discourse has always vilified private sector performance, achievement, right? And we have terms in Nepali that's not nice, aimed towards businessmen. And I don't come from a business family. My parents didn't engage in business, but as a student of economics, I always understood the role private sector plays, right? You don't have to be a PhD economist, some fancy degree from somewhere, right? You open Economics 101, you realize private sector development is very important for a country's prosperity. Why haven't we understood this? If you look at our bureaucracy, what has happened in our bureaucracy is that, a lot of people, recently I had this incident with a joint secretary in one of the ministries where he had gone through exams to get to where he is, right? I asked him, were you ever asked in your Lok Seva exam the role of private sector in a country's growth, economic performance? He said, oh, not exactly. And I asked him a few more questions along these lines. It's amazing. It's amazing. So you have people in governments who don't have neither the understanding of what drives economic growth, are making policies for our country. So people guiding them, providing them vision. Somehow also, many of them maybe perhaps don't understand that. And I think that has really led to this situation because, the market in Nepal is not that small. We're not Bhutan. We're still 40 billion economy, 45 billion, and we're marching towards 100 billion. Some people talk about 100 billion economy in Nepal, right? So the market is not that small. And how many bicycles get sold in Nepal? How many shoes get sold in Nepal, right? So we should be how many TVs, how many computers? So we do sell many of these in our market. So I think we can still leverage that. Maybe not like India and China does. India can tell Apple, invest 500 million into my economy if you want to sell iPhones. We cannot say that to Apple. Well, maybe we can say to another company, right? Something a bit less difficult to achieve.
Hearing Samir, I ended my conversation with him exploring if the budget enthuses a Nepali economist like him, and whether we are progressively seeing a shift in economic thinking and planning. This is what Samir had to say.
Yeah, the budget did sound very nice and good, and it's aspirational. More importantly, it shows that maybe we're coming around to a consensus on a few things that are key for economic growth, right? And job creation, economic growth. And one of them being, the role of entrepreneurship, industrial development, right? Because some of the programs that are listed underneath it, even the economic triangle, Bharatpur, Butwal, Pokhara, the economic triangle. That's one example of that, right? So people are realizing that's important. And as you said earlier, of course, we have seen this in other parts of developing Asia, but has there been homework done? That's a different story, right? Similarly, when you look at, the reforms that they're going to carry out to increase capital expenditure, another good aspect of the budget. And I hope that those do get done. Doing business environment, they want to improve that. That's also a very good thing, right? As I said, but of course, the infrastructure aspect is also important. And even on the infrastructure side, they have come up with specific measures to sort of promote completion of projects on time, right? Besides the Rashtriya Gaurav projects, there's other projects where I think there's some time limits in terms of contract awards, disbursement for projects. So I think that's also very encouraging, because they're coming around to the fact that those things are very important, right? And having no change in leadership at the project management unit level. So these things are there in the budget. So those are very, very encouraging. But there are certain aspects, and so I would have to commend the finance minister for these few things that he has included. And the sector focus, I generally agree with them. Some of the broader objectives, I also agree with them. But, when I look at why projects don't get done on time, this is a perennial issue in Nepal. One aspect that it does try to address this also, the civil service. Civil service, they want to reform the civil service. I don't know if they will manage or how they will manage, because, this constant movement of people across ministries, it doesn't help us at all. There's no institutional memory, so it's very difficult to get projects done on time. The interministerial coordination becomes much weaker, which is critical for implementing projects on time. The coordination aspect is very critical. And the other thing is also, so those are nice things in the budget, right? So when it comes to foreign investment, there's one piece of evidence I recently heard that one of the factors that foreign investors don't like to come to Nepal is, this contract risk, sort of contract enforcement.
Yes.
They don't think the contracts will be enforced. And this is something, we have to address this, right? Is it our judicial system that's weak, when it comes to commercial disputes? We need to address this as well. So as you can see, it's not just procurement, right? It's also our legal system, our project management ability, supervision and regulation, monitoring and evaluation. All these things are so important to really, to implement the budget. So I hope there's efforts in that area as well. But, just looking through it, skimming through the budget, some of the focus, it's all in the right direction. Make in Nepal. It's music to my ears, really, Of course, they maybe might have copied it from India, made in India, right? Under Modi. I don't know how much homework that was done. Like if somebody were to ask folks who wrote that make in Nepal, how many products do we make in Nepal that are competitive or that are good, Can they give a list? So this is something that's very important, right? We need to do that bit of a homework, not just have slogans. And usually, we have this habit of celebrating when budget is announced that, such nice things were in the budget. I would actually suggest to sort of, 9 months later, 10 months later, to see how it's being implemented. And that's when you really can see, what the budget managed to do or not do. So, yeah.
The next interesting observation on the budget was the framing on the transformative sectors. The budget has identified 5, namely agriculture, energy, information and technology development, tourism promotion, and finally, entrepreneurship and industrial development. And do people in these sectors really see the budget walking the talk? We talked to experts from these relevant sectors, and this is what they had to say.
The policy and program of this fiscal year announced for the investment decade for agriculture.
That was Dr. Yamuna Ghale, a food security and agriculture sector expert.
But on the contrary, the budget, the total volume of the budget for the sector has been decreased compared to even last year, this current fiscal year. The agriculture sector is the one which is the most federalized sector, and the Schedule 8 of the Constitution has given the rights to the local governments, especially exclusive rights for the local governments, especially for agriculture services, including food and nutrition security, and also land management, cooperative management, and many other details. But if you look into the budget, that doesn't give that kind of impression. The thing specifically is that the huge challenge of outgoing of youths from the country as well as from the sector, because everybody is trying to come out of agriculture sector because youths are not very impressed with the agriculture sector, and there the budget is not very responsive in making sure that youths will be retained in agriculture. Interestingly, the amount of the budget that they have allocated for the chemical fertilizer has increased. And we know how the chemical fertilizer import process has been dealt by, and then how the farmers are struggling to get those fertilizers. And then now just by increasing the budget doesn't make sense, because it's not about the budget, it's about the total management system of the agriculture inputs management. So only increasing the budget doesn't make much sense is one thing. The second thing is, in the given context of climate change, and also in the given context of federalized context, where the local governments are very much responsible for adapting their local climate, culture, and the food habit specific farming system, the priority should have been more towards organic, or towards healthy soil, towards watershed management, towards clean energy promotion kind of sector that should have been promoted than investing on chemical fertilizer as a major input. So this is where I see lots of contradictory, and which will have a long-term impact on soil health, and it has a comprehensive impact on the food system.
म भीम गौतम, म प्रमुख कार्यकारी स्वतन्त्र ऊर्जा उत्पादकहरूको संस्था इपान। यही गत वर्ष प्रधानमन्त्री पुष्पकमल दाहालले भारत गएर
It was expected that the budget would provide additional momentum to the sector, especially considering recent developments on power trade and the need to facilitate investments to meet the targets set by the government to generate 28,500 megawatts by 2035. The government is likely to add to the national grid the stated 900 to 1,000 megawatt capacity by next year. However, it is unlikely to meet targets around realizing the major reservoir projects like Budi Gandaki and Nausingad. These slogans have been continuing across several budget cycles. The key challenge has been around implementation, and this for the sector means securing financing for the projects being discussed. This is highly uncertain and extremely challenging. The budget does not look overly pleasing from the perspective of the private sector, who are the key players in the sector. While there is some mention of private sector role in the transmission and distribution, this is somewhat of a long process. The immediate interest for the private sector is on incentives for expanding generation as well as facilitating trade. However, the budget does not sufficiently address these issues. It is not speaking on the role of the private sector on electricity trade. It is a major disappointment and a loss to the sector.
यी दुईटा कुरा चाहिँ बजेटले सबभन्दा बढी प्रायोरिटी दिएर आउँछ भन्ने अनुमान गरिएको थियो हैन तर यी दुवै कुरा आएन त्यसले चाहिँ अलिकति अपेक्षा गरेको भन्दा ऊर्जा क्षेत्रमा अलिकति फरक तरिकाको बजेट आयो भन्ने एउटा निष्कर्ष थियो र अनुमान भन्दा अलि फरक बजेट आयो भन्ने मलाई लाग्यो मेरो व्यक्तिगत चाहिँ
The budget also extensively talks about the development of the IT sector. I reached out to Sikshit Bhatta, a fintech entrepreneur, and he had some interesting comments around complementarities between the IT and the energy sector. This is what he had to say.
I think we need to think in terms of energy, even if we are talking about IT. So, what the government has done in this particular budget is, I think it has raised the expectations of public that we are going to export so many billion worth of IT work out of Nepal. I think the kind of IT work that the government talks about is particularly skills like coding and engineering. But when we speak about the existing times and the way we are making a transition into artificial intelligence, I think most of the skills on which we have hedged our bet would be obsolete in next 5 years. So where should we focus is a big question. And I think our focus should be on how we can use our energy. If you're looking at the world for next 10, 15 or 20 years down the line, either the world will be filled with data centers or solar arrays, because there will be a lot of energy that would be consumed to do this task, right? So when we're talking about the government creating jobs for IT sector where they could code and send the skills abroad, I think those codes would be done by machines, and those machines would be the industries of the fourth industrial revolution. And the industries of the fourth industrial revolution would be the data centers. I think it is about right time for our government to invest itself seeking these opportunities where the enormous amount of energy we can produce is not only sold to our neighbors to light up their households or power their industries of the industrial revolution that are producing physical goods, but I think it is about time where we seek partnership and develop policies and separate budgets to use these energies to have these companies come in and invest in their fourth generation industry, which is the data. So we need to think in terms of energy and data. That's something that I would wish for, or at least I would allocate a certain budget, or at least I would initiate these kind of conversations.
Thank you for tuning into yet another episode of Pods by PEI. This episode was produced by Soumitra Neupane with support from Nirjan Rai, Khushi Hang, and me, Hriday Sapkota. The episode was recorded at PEI Studio and was edited and sound designed by me, Hriday. If you haven't subscribed to our podcast, you can do so at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to Pods by PEI. Thank you again from me, Hriday. We'll see you soon in our next episode.